Hey everyone, Devin here. Now today I want to talk to you about not only an incredible hydrometeorological double event, but about the concept of antecedent conditions and how they apply to this event. Now, I want you all to come on a journey with me back in time to August of 2011. Now if you're from the Gulf Coast, you probably remember quite a bit of rain. But if you're like me from New England, you probably remember a lot of rain. So much rain that it made the Connecticut River look like this. Yeah. The inundation that we saw in New England was due to the combined effects of Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. So, here's the breakdown. Irene formed in the Atlantic on August 21st, and it reached up to a Category 3 strength while it was over the Caribbean. However, by the time it first reached the US mainland in North Carolina on the 27th, it was only a Category 1. It actually remained that strength when it made landfall a second time in New Jersey the following day on the 28th. Now it slowly continued rolling through the Northeast for several more days, dropping unprecedented rainfall totals across the board. 400 millimeters alone were recorded in one area of North Carolina. That's 15 inches of rain. Other areas of the Northeast along Irene's path saw up to 250 millimeters, or close to 10 inches. Now Lee, on the other hand, was actually a Gulf storm that formed on August 30th, only 9 days after Irene. Even though Lee only reached a classification of subtropical cyclone by the time it made landfall in Louisiana, it still brought incredible amounts of rain to the Gulf Coast, with totals again reaching close to 15 inches in some areas. Now, Lee began to disorganize fairly quickly, but that was definitely not the end of it. Lee's remnants actually ended up following a frontal boundary northeastward, dropping even more rain on an already inundated New England, less than 3 weeks after Irene had passed. Now, as you'd expect, all of that rain generated some gnarly river flows and flooding. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Vermont, you name it, everywhere was affected. But here's where things get interesting. Now, in the Northeast, most of that flooding was due to Hurricane Irene, with Lee only mildly contributing as it passed through. In the mid-Atlantic, however, like in Pennsylvania and Virginia, it was actually Tropical Storm Lee that caused the flooding, with Irene generating only mild flows. Now, how is that possible, you might be thinking? And the answer to that, my friends, is antecedent conditions. Now, antecedent is defined as preceding in time or order, previous or pre-existing. So, in our case, the pre-existing conditions we're interested in are precipitation and soil moisture. Now, before Irene hit, the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast were in two different antecedent states. The Mid-Atlantic was unusually dry, having received not much precipitation in the weeks before, whereas up in New England it was unusually wet, with uncharacteristically high precipitation totals, especially for that late in the summer. So, what does this have to do with our storms? Think of it this way. I have this sponge here. It's dry. Let's pretend it's our soil. Now, this is like our dry antecedent conditions. As I add water, most of it gets absorbed by the sponge and very little will get away, say into our surrounding streams, until of course the sponge is full. Now let's say I start with a partially wet sponge already. This is going to signify our wet antecedent conditions. Now, as you can see, it will still absorb a little bit of water, but it doesn't take very long before that water is spit out. This is the same thing with the soil. If the soil already has a bunch of water in it, it's not going to be able to retain as much as it would if it was dry. So in the case of our example, the Mid-Atlantic was like that dry sponge and New England was like that wet sponge. By the time Irene came through, all that dry soil in the Mid-Atlantic states was able to suck up all the rainfall and really mitigate any flooding that came out afterwards. Whereas by the time it reached up into New England, it couldn't take in as much because it was so wet, leading to all that massive amounts of flooding. But that's still not the whole story, because now we have Lee to worry about. So all these mid-coastal states after Irene have now been rained on, so by the time Lee comes through, they behave more like a wet sponge. Different antecedent conditions, which cause those states to now see that same level of flooding that we had seen in New England. Of course, research in this field is still ongoing. There's an incredible amount of variables that determine an environment's response to storms of this size, let alone storms that have compounding effects like Irene and Lee had. Now in the Northeast, this is even more important because we're not only projected to have an increased frequency of these storms, but an increased frequency of storms of higher magnitude. So having a handle on any given area's response to storms of this size will allow for better management practices to be developed and then an increased level of preparedness in the path of storms to come. So, I thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something.